Hello and welcome to our course where we're going to be demonstrating how to build out 3 projects from scratch, all using JavaScript and all about JavaScript DOM interaction. My name is Lawrence and I'm going to be your instructor for this course. I come to you with many years of web development experience, ready to help you learn more about JavaScript. I really enjoy working with JavaScript, and JavaScript provides us the opportunity to create some amazing applications. I've been a web developer for over 18 years. I've been a course instructor for over 4 years. And one of my favorite topics to work with is JavaScript. So in the upcoming lessons, we're going to be building out 3 different projects. The first project, a text, copy, and move application. This is going to provide you the opportunity to practice selecting element content, moving it into another field, as well as copying content into your clipboard. Practicing creating elements dynamically using JavaScript, executing commands with, and manipulating element inputs using JavaScript. The next exercise is going to be a shopping list and gives you the ability to add items to the shopping list. You can also delete items from that shopping list. And then best of all, and the most interesting one, is where you can edit items within that shopping list. So you can update the item, click off of it, and you can see that it gets updated. This section is going to demonstrate how to build objects with JavaScript, how to build out tables dynamically using JavaScript. So there's no tables within the source code. And as you can see, we're very limited to the amount of HTML that we're using. Visual part is generated using JavaScript. We've just got that one output element, a couple input elements, and that's it. And the rest of this is all JavaScript. And of course, the objective of the upcoming lessons and section is to practice and learn more about JavaScript, DOM manipulation, element selection using JavaScript. Last but not least, we're going to create an image generating application. So this is going to generate a placeholder image, give you the ability to set different sizes of the image, update the text that is being presented on the image. Once you've clicked off of the input field, it's going to copy this content into the clipboard, as well as display it to the user so they can really easily utilize it and bring into their projects. The background color as well as the text color as needed. And you can see that this all adjusts the path of the placeholder image as well as the visual image that's being displayed out to the user. And once again, this is a great exercise to practice and get more familiar with input fields, adding event listeners to those input fields, and manipulating the content that's being presented within the web page. JavaScript is a prerequisite to this course, so having a fundamental core understanding of the JavaScript concepts is essential, as we are going to be focused on building applications, practicing exercises with JavaScript. HTML and CSS is also a prerequisite to this course. Source code is included, and I do encourage you to work alongside the lessons as you work through the different sections of this course and become more familiar with what is possible with JavaScript. Try the code out for yourself within your own editor, see how it works, get comfortable with it, get familiar with it. So I know you're excited to get started. So next lesson, we're going to jump right in and start building out some amazing applications with JavaScript. Before we create our copy to clipboard application, we're going to need some HTML elements. First of all, we need a text area. So this is where the content is going to be that we want to copy. And we can give this one a name of copy text. So this is going to be the source text. Set up some rows for this as well as columns. And of course, you can style this as needed when necessary. So for now, we'll just put in hello world into that text area, refresh it. There we go. We've got a text area that we can use. So this is going to be basically our source text area. And I can put some content there. So source text. I'll do a line break. So there's our source text. Next, we're going to need a button or a couple of buttons. So the first button that we're going to create is going to move the text, and the second one is going to copy to the clipboard. So just apply some classes, and we can call this the mover button, move, and then the other button is going to be the one that's going to copy into the clipboard. So you press the mover button and it's going to move the content into the other text area, and the copy is going to place that into the clipboard. So that gives us a couple buttons to work with. Let's create another line break here. And then lastly, we can add our other text area down below. So this is just another text area element, and this can be and I'll set some properties for this as well, some attributes. And this one can be blank. So when we refresh it, we've got our source text, we've got a couple buttons to create some actions, and lastly I'm going to create one more element where we can output some content. And this is another element that we can interact with using JavaScript. So next what we want to do is set up our JavaScript objects to prepare them to be used within our code. So that means that we want to select all of these elements that we just created and put them into object format. So opening up our script area within our JavaScript, this is where we've got our main text, or we can call it the same if we wanted to. We could call it copy text to keep things simple. So that's going to be a variable object that's going to be referred to as copy text. And we're using query selector in order to select the element. So the element that we're looking for is the text area object. And we do have two elements that are text areas. So we need to be more specific in order to select the one that we're looking for. And the one that we're looking for is going to have specific names. So that's what's different between the two elements. We've got one with a name of copy text, and we've got another one with a name of final text. So let's add those both in as objects in JavaScript. And I'll use the same format. So this one's final text. And let's make sure that we do have them within our JavaScript. And usually the way that I do that is I output the object name. And if I get the element showing up within the console, then that means that we're all good to move on and utilize that within our JavaScript. So final text is working, copy text is working. Let's also add in the other elements into our JavaScript objects. So we're using const because these are objects connecting to the elements, and they're not going to be actually changing. We're not adding any additional values. So that's why we're setting them up as const. And we can call these mover button. So the same format as before, using document and query selector, selecting the element with a class of mover button. I make this bigger because we're running out of space here, and also do the same thing for the copy button. So at the end of this, you're going to have all of your elements as objects in JavaScript, and that's going to make it really easy when we start coding in order to utilize these elements and manipulate them and pretty much do as you need to do within the code. So next, last, but of course not least, one more element that we're selecting is the one that has the class of output. And this is another area element that we can make use of within our code where we can output some content. Completed all that. It's always a good idea just to make sure that you do have them all within your element content, and just refresh. So we've got our output element, we've got our copy button. So all of those are ready to go. And last, the mover button. So all the elements have now been selected as JavaScript objects, and we saw that now we can use them within our code. So go ahead and set up your project, and this is the basic setup that you're going to need in order to follow through with the upcoming lessons. So set up a couple text areas, a couple buttons to create some interaction, and also an output area, just a regular div where you can dump some content into. And then using JavaScript, connect them as objects in your JavaScript code, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson. Hello and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to add interaction to the elements. We've already selected the elements from the page and added them in as JavaScript objects. So we're ready to move on to the next step where we're adding event listeners in. And the first event listener that we want to add some event listeners to the buttons that we've created. We've got one button called mover BTN. So let's select that JavaScript object and add an event listener to that object. And we also have an option for adding in the different click events. So the click event that we're adding in is we're listening for a click, and if it does get clicked, then what we want to do is invoke a function, and the function that is going to get invoked, we'll create one called move text, and by default this is false anyway, so this is the capture, the Boolean capture. We can keep it added in or we can remove it, and in this case we're just going to be removing it out of our function. Create a function called move text, and whenever this button gets clicked, we're going to select the content that's contained within our copy text. So let's create a default element. We'll call it temp. And this is what's going to be contained within the copy text, selecting out the value of that current object. And we want to move the text. So from hello world, when we click the button Move Text, we'll want to paste it into our final text object. So let's select that final text object and set the value of that to be equal to temp. And refresh, and we'll try that out. So now whenever we click Move Text, any text that we have within our main text area is going to get moved down to the bottom text field. The next option that we wanted to add in is we want to copy the text to clipboard. So this is also an event listener that we're going to add in, and we're adding it in not to the mover button, but to the copy button. And this one can be called copy text. Let's create a function in order to handle that. And creating that function, copy text. And this is the one where we want to actually copy it to the clipboard. So selecting out that text that we want to copy, we can create a variable called temp. So within copy text, let's create a new function, copy to clipboard, and we're going to pass in our temp text into there. And now let's create another function, and this function is going to be called copy to clipboard. And the reason that I'm doing it this way is, and this is passing in a string value that we want to copy. So the reason I'm doing it this way, and I'm separating out the functions so that we can access this function within different formats. So we don't have to always do it through the copy text button. We can simply invoke the function copy to clipboard, copy and send a string value through the copy to clipboard function, and that will copy it automatically into the clipboard. So we're going to create an element. And this is going to be a blank text area. So using document, create element, giving us the ability to create elements. And I'll show you what, we'll console log this out for now so you can see what it looks like. So this is just going to be a variable called text area. So when I hit copy to clipboard, we get this element with text area. So we want to populate it with that value. So we've got our text area. This is the one that we've just created. Populate it with the value of string. Add this newly created text area, append it to our document object. So document, and using the body, append child. So this will append this newly created text area to body section. So let's try that out. So we do move text, and we can do an inspect as well. Actually, it should be copy text. And there's our text field, text area that we're creating. And this is dynamically generated, and it's just showing up there. And so there's a few other things that we need to do. So we need to take that text area and do a select of it so that we have a selected object that we know that we're working with. So once again, copy text, you see that it is selected, and that's all done via JavaScript. Once we've selected that text area, we're ready to execute a command, and the command that executing is copy. So that's document, execute command, allows you to run a command to manipulate the contents of an editable region, and we've already selected that editable region in the previous statement. That's grabbing that copy text, running the command copy, and let's do that one more time. So copy text, and now when I'm pasting, so over there I'm just going to paste, and you see that it's dropping that in. So we also need to remove it from the document body, because we don't want a whole bunch of these being visible. So we're going to simply select that and remove child. And we're putting into the copy command, and then we're removing it. So this is actually going to copy it into copy, paste it whenever we want. So that was just a Control V paste onto that element. Select that output and let the user know that, so let's do H3, and right now it's in the clipboard. And you can also add that content that's been copied. So this is all sitting within that text area value. So whatever that text area value. So even though we've removed it from the document body and we've appended to the document body, that text area value is still alive and still available to access within that function. So let's see how that works. So copy, and you can see that copied content is hello world. And if we update this, copied content is hello world. And now I can go to paste, and you can see that we're pasting that copied content. So we're able to add it into our clipboard. So go ahead and add in this functionality. And one of the reasons that we had to create a text area is that we want to be able to select that text area. And we want it to have this function to be a little bit more dynamic. If we were just working with that one text area and we want to copy out that text area, we could have selected that text area value and simply done a copy on that. So done a select on the text area that we want to copy and copied that in. But because we want some more versatility to our copy to clipboard function, that's where we went and we created the text area, added in that value, appended it to our body, selected it, copied it, removed it from the body, and then gave that information to the user that we've copied it to their clipboard. So go ahead and add in this functionality and add in the different clip events. And coming up next, we're going to finalize the application. Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to finalize our content, and we want to add in the ability to select all. So whenever we click on here, we want basically all of that content to be selected automatically. So let's add that in, and we can add that in by a click event. So selecting that final text object, let's add an event listener, and this event listener is going to be listening for a clicked, and we'll just do a select all function, and we'll create that function right now. So function, and we called it select all. What we want to do is select all of the contents of that element that's invoking this, that's triggering this event. So this is going to be really easy to do, where we're just selecting this object and applying select. So just as we saw when we were copying it to the clipboard, whenever we've got an active area, an element, an input or a text area, we can do a select all on that by running a function, a method in JavaScript called select. So what this is going to do is this is simply going to select all of the contents there and make it all highlight. So let's try that out. So now whenever I click on here, it's going to select all of that content. And this should actually not only be on final text, we should also put it on the copy text as well and add it into copy text. And that's the nice thing about having these functions, because you can reuse them wherever you need to have them. So I've got it within there, and whenever I move the text, whenever I click on this section, I've got that highlighting as well. So we can highlight any one of these text areas now simply by clicking on them and highlight all of the content contained with. So now that you've got your application working as intended, and one of the most important things again was to get more familiar with the executing command and specifically copying it to the clipboard. So go ahead and try that out for yourself and get familiar with it, and also add in the ability to select text areas when all of the content within the text areas when you click on it. And coming up next, we'll do a final code review. Hello and welcome back. This lesson we're going to do a final code review. So we started out by setting up our text area and our input areas. So we needed one text area that we can input content into. And whatever content we add into this main text area, we want to be able to select and move to the other text area, to the second area, text area. And we also want to have the ability to copy it to the clipboard. So when you select copy text, this actually copies it to the clipboard, and we get a little message here that's output to the user. So it tells us copied content, and then it outputs that copied content. So now we've got some content within the clipboard, and if I go and press paste, you can see that we're actually pasting in that content. So what it did is it selected the text area content and copied it to the clipboard. So this was a little bit of fun with text areas and how we can copy things to the clipboard. So let's quickly run through the source code. So we had no styling, and of course you can apply styling, make this look a whole lot better. We've also got some basic HTML. So we needed some basic HTML structure, such as a couple text areas. So one where we could have the string contents that we want to copy and move, and then also another text area where we can output that content into. And then lastly, we also had a couple buttons that we needed to introduce our functionality. We used JavaScript to place these all into objects within our JavaScript code so that we could really easily access them and use them. We added a bunch of event listeners. So these are all the interactions that are possible within our page. We have one for moving the text. So what that does is it selects the content from the copy text, and then it pastes it into the final text area. And you could also shorten this by having final text value equal copy text value, and that will get rid of that one line of syntax if you wanted to do that. Also, we have the copy text. So we've got a function that's got copy text. So it places the content from that text area, once again selecting that using value. And the reason that we have the value here instead of out here, if we had it here within the global object and we did the copy text value, then this would be the value at the time when the code is loading. So we wouldn't have that updates and changes. So that's where we need to select the value when we're making use of that content. We're next passing it into a function called copy to clipboard. The reason that it's done this way is to make it more flexible, more flexibility with the code in case we want to use copy to clipboard in some other areas, not just in that one text area. We're creating a function for that. So maybe we want to have another button that does something similar, copies it to clipboard and moves it. So that will give us the ability to do that and simply launch it into a function. So we don't have to redo all of this functionality. Creating a separate function for that. So this is where the core of the application sits, and this is copy to clipboard, the function. Again, for creating this and making it more dynamic, we chose to create a text element, another text area. And if we only had just the one and all of the content was always coming from the one, we could have selected it. So applied the select to the copy text area, and we would have been able to select that and place that within our copy. But because we want more flexibility, maybe we want to copy different text and be able to pass in whatever string value we want into the copy to clipboard, we've got that flexibility there. And I'll show you how that works. If I clear this out, I can always pass in whatever text I want into this function. And if I type in, so passing in that JavaScript string, and now whenever I paste, I've got just JavaScript. So that's how the copy to clipboard works. It provides us more flexibility in being able to provide different string values, and it would always work the same way. So what we had to do is we had to create this text area on the fly, apply a value to it, add it to the body, select all of that text area, and then remove it from the body object in order to complete our functionality. And then down here, we've just got an output to the user that we've copied the text. We can get rid of the console message. And this is the main core where we're adding it into the clipboard by the execute command copy. Thanks again for taking this section. If you have any questions or comments, I'm always happy to help clarify any of the content presented within the earlier lessons. And I did want to note before we conclude that all of the source code is included, and I do suggest that you try the code out for yourself and get familiar with it and get comfortable with working with the JavaScript functions we've presented in the course. Hello and welcome. In this section, we're going to be setting up a grocery list. Let's start by setting up our HTML. We need an input, so this is going to be type text input, and this is going to be where we can add new items. So giving it an ID of add item. We also need to have a button in order to add the items into our list. So input and type, and this type can be button. Giving it an ID of add new with a value of add item. And lastly, let's create a div, give it a class, and this is where our output is going to sit. And we're going to add all of our output dynamically using JavaScript. So see what this looks like. And there's not really a whole lot to see quite yet. We also need to create a few elements as well within our JavaScript. And one of them being our main array. We're going to use this as let, so my list. And let's add some items into the list. So these are grocery items, so we can have things like bananas, and of course milk, apples, eggs, and how about some cake? So there's our list of items that we want to add in. So this is our default list. We're going to listen for window on load, which will invoke the function build whenever the window loads. And this is the function that we're going to use in order to build our initial screen area. So this is where we're going to be building our table and our initial list. And that we're going to show you in the upcoming lesson. So there's one other thing that I do want to still set up, and that's selecting some of the elements that we have on our page so that we're ready to make use of them within our JavaScript code. So we've got a button. I want to make that button active. So setting up an object called const button, BTN, and I'll just call it button add. And then documents, query selector. So we're selecting that element object, the button. And that's the one with the ID of add new. So we're using ID this time in order to select that. And let's make that button clickable by adding an event listener. So adding an event listener, listen for the click, and then we've got our function that's going to get invoked once that button gets clicked. And for now, what we'll do is we'll console log out. And eventually what this will do is this will add new items into our list. So that is all still yet to come. And we're going to be adding in all of this functionality in the upcoming lessons. So this was the basic structure that we needed for our application. So go ahead and set this up, set up the input fields, set up an output area where we can drop our content and add our content using JavaScript dynamically. And then we've got another one that's called onload, window onload, and that's a function called build. And this is just whenever our document object is ready to go, the construction can begin for our output of our list. Under the build function that we created, we're going to construct a table all using JavaScript and then add it into the class, the element with the class of output. Let's begin. So first of all, we need our main table, so we can create an element using document, create element, and the element that we want to create is table. This is our main table container that we're creating and constructing. Next part of it is that we want to add all of the rows, and we can do that by looping through the my list, creating a simple loop. So this can be a for loop. So let I equals 0. And the looping through while I is less than my list length, incrementing I by 1. So we have a wait out of the loop. Next, let's create some rows and document, create element. And the element that we want to create is a row, so tr. And you can create any element you want within this type of format. And because this is an object, we can add a value to it. So I can add an index value if I wanted to. And I'm going to just match that index value because we're going to use this later on. This is going to be corresponding to the index value of the items in the my list. So I'm adding it in as an index value so we're able to select the item back out of the list when we need to. Next, we're going to create a table element, a TD, a table cell, using the same format once again. So create, and the element that we're creating are TDs. Let's see what that looks like right now. So not a whole lot, nothing's being output quite yet. And then within each one of the table cells, so we're going to probably create a few of these. So this cell is going to have an inner HTML, and the contents of this cell are going to be the inner HTML of my list. So whatever the value is. And as we're looping through the lists, we're going to get bananas, milk, apples, eggs, cake. So now that we've got that cell, we also want to provide a few other options. So we want to create another cell. So how about we call this one cell 1, and we're going to create another cell. So we'll create a cell 2. And cell 2 is going to contain our button options that we can use in order to click and create some type of action. So let's add those ones in. So this is another table cell. And then within here, I want to create some clickable elements. So I know we're creating quite a few things. We can also start adding them on to the parents. So this cell can be added into the row and as well as the next cell. So let's add that in using append child. And what that will do is that gives us the ability to append the newly created objects. And as we iterate through, we want to also append the row to the table. So we want to use the table object, so that's that main table object, using append child, and then we're going to append each row at the end of that row. And then finally, let's output whatever the value of table is so we can see the table being constructed. So there's our table. We've got a row, we've got a cell, so the first cell has bananas, next one's going to have milk, the next one's going to have apples, and so on. So we want to add in a few other elements here within this table, within this cell, and that's going to give us the ability to delete and edit. So those are going to be two active elements where we're going to have different types of click events and click handlers on those. So adding those in, and we can just simply add those into cell 2. So the first one is going to be const, and this could be a span 1. And again, using documents, create elements, and I know we're creating a whole bunch of elements on the fly, and you could probably do it a whole lot easier with just HTML, but of course this is JavaScript, and we want to make sure that we have the ability to practice JavaScript. So span 1 will have inner text of delete. This is going to be essentially our delete button. And then once we're completed, we can add that in, so we can append it. So taking cell 2, we're going to append child to it. And the child that we're appending is span 1. Now we've got quite a lot going on here. I want to create some additional spans as well. So we can also still call them the regular spans, but I like to keep them separate. So we'll have span 2. And this span 2, what this one is going to do is this is going to allow us to edit. So adding all of that in, let's see what this looks like now. So we've got our table, we've got our table cells, and we haven't quite added them in yet to the row. And that's what we need to do next, where we need to append it to the row. So we've got a lot of different things happening here, and this should add that other cell into our table. So now let's take a look at our table. So we've got our table cell, and we've got the delete edit, so everything looks pretty good. And we're ready to finalize this table and add it into the output. So append child, and the child that we're appending is the table. So let's make it visible within our HTML. So do a quick refresh and make sure, we need to add output as an object. So taking output and selecting it using document, query selector, and selecting the element with the class of out. And this time when we refresh it, we've got our list there. So we're ready to add that in. We also might want to add a little bit of styling now that we can see that content. So for the spans, let's add some styling in that. We'll do a smaller font size for those spans. We'll do a color of red so that we can distinguish between them. And let's also add in some padding of 5 pixels there. And you can also create classes and add classes as needed, of course. Go ahead and add in your JavaScript in order to generate your table on the fly, all using JavaScript. Coming up next, I'll show you how to create interaction with edit and delete. So that's coming up next in the next lesson. Welcome back. Were you able to build your table with JavaScript? This lesson, we're going to create some interaction. And as we see, we've got delete, we've got edit, but they're not doing a whole lot. So what we want is something to happen. I'm also going to update the cursor. I usually like to change the cursor to be a pointer so that whenever we hover over these particular elements, we know that there's some type of action that can be taken, or the player, the user, knows there's something that you can do with these characters. So going into our build function that we created in the last lesson, let's add some interaction with delete. So we've got that element that we're creating on the fly using JavaScript, and this is the ideal time to add in an event listener as well. So now that we've got that object, we can add event listener, and if we want to add in a click, it's as easy as just doing click, and then we can specify a function, or we can run an anonymous function. So for now, how about we add in the anonymous function, and doing it this way, because we're doing it within this block of code, we still have access to I. And I is actually really important because it's going to tell us which item we're on within the my list. And when we're deleting, what we want to do is actually we want to remove an item from the array. So just to show you what happens now, I can select a particular item, and whenever we click delete, we can get that index value of the item. See how nice and neatly that comes out? So if I wanted to take it out of my list, I can use my list array and specify I. And so whenever these get clicked, I can click delete, and we can see that we got those values that are contained. So this is actually coming from the array directly. It's not coming from those closest elements. And you can also do a few different functions as well in JavaScript. There's a way to get the table row, so you can get some information out of there. And if we want to get this I value, we can get that as well. So we can do a JavaScript function, and I'll just do a quick temp one here where we're doing temp, and we've got this, and we can do closest. And what closest does is it allows us to find the closest element that matches our query. So if we want to do a tr, this is the closest tr, and I'll console log out whatever the value of temp is. So if I click delete, we're grabbing that whole table row, and then we can navigate down to the first child if we wanted to. And then that gives us the ability to return back that information that's contained within there. And we could also at this point get the value of IND. So this is the value that we're setting over here, and it's actually going to be the same thing. So we're getting that index value. So there's a number of ways to do this. And if you don't have the function here, if you've got some other functionality, you can do it this way as well. But we don't actually need to because it's nice and easy and neatly laid out for us. So I'll leave closest in there because closest is a really great function if you do need to navigate up and select different values that are contained within an element. And especially if you've already created this table and if you're updating with JavaScript, if you're not building it out from scratch every time, then using closest is a really nice, neat function to try out and add in. So now that we've got that array item, we've got a value that we can use within arrays where we can use splice. So you're getting the item out. So item out, creating a variable for that. We've got our array. So let's go through the my list and using splice, which allows us to change the content of an array, adding new elements while removing old elements. So basically what that's doing is that allows us to specify an index value. So we already have that index value of I, and we want to return back one item that's located at index I. And of course, we don't have a value for temp anymore, so let's delete that and clear that up. So when we click apples, we're returning back apples, and we're actually removing it out of the array at this point. So if we do the console log in my list, what's going to happen and what you'll see is that it's no longer available in the list. So if I take eggs out, eggs is not going to be available in the list. Cake is not going to be available in the list, and so on. So now we've got bananas, apples, eggs. So what's happening here's things are getting a little bit messed up. So we need to have in one more function, and this function is actually going to be that we need to rebuild our list because our numbering is getting thrown off. So let's try that one more time. So we delete apples, then we rebuild the list without the apples. So that means that we've got one more thing that we need to do on build, where we take output and we update the inner HTML, or we can put a heading. So that will clear out all of the existing contents. And so now when I press delete, you see that they get deleted out from the list. So we can regenerate it and delete. And that's because we're rebuilding the list every time. So go ahead and add this into your project, add in the event listener. And coming up next, we still need to add in one for edit. So that's still to come in the upcoming lesson. In the previous lesson, we saw how we can remove an item from our list by pressing delete. And what we're doing is we're just rebuilding the list. And because we're rebuilding the list every time, it's based on the array, which is contained within my list. So if we add something, and if we want to add something, it's as easy as updating our array and then launching build again. So we want to push an item to our list. We can select the contents that's contained within the add item variable. So taking another value, we're going to select that object, and this is going to be our new item. And selecting using query selector, we're going to select the element with add item as the value. And then we just need to get the value from that input. So we'll check to see if that one has a value. And if it does, then we're going to add it into our list. And if it doesn't, then we're not going to do anything because we don't want to add any blank values in there. So let's try that out. And now we do add item. All we did is clicked. If we do test, we're adding it into our list. And then lastly, we still need to rebuild our list. So whenever we push content into our array, we want to rebuild our list. So now if I do test, you see test gets added in there, and it's got the same functionality that we had earlier. So we've got the delete. We can add as many of them as we want, and then of course we can delete as many as we want as well. As again, we're just simply rebuilding that array. So whatever contents are in the array is what's going to get output when we launch the function build. So the next thing that we want to do, and the last thing that we want to do, is have the ability to edit that content. So if you got something in the list, you don't quite want to delete it, you don't want to add a new item, you want to edit it. So this is going to be a little bit trickier, but still possible. And we're going to do it kind of the same way as we did with the event listener that we added into the span as we were creating them, except this time we need to have the ability to edit it. So that's coming up in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to add the ability to edit the elements. And this is, as said, a little bit more tricky than the delete because we need to have the ability to update the my list, change this maybe into an input field, and then have the ability for the user to update some of that content. So let's add that in. And the same way that we did the event listener for span 1, we can do the event listener for span 2. Or we could have it as a separate function. And in this case, we're going to do it all within that same function. And of course, you can break it up as needed, of course. So we've got our event listener, we've got a function, and this function, we want to have the ability to update that element. So let's first, we're going to select the parent. So taking our variable, and we could always select row as well because we do have it within a row object. So we can do something easy like row style and do background color and set the background color to, let's say, yellow. So when we refresh and we click edit, you see that it turns yellow. So that's ideal, and that's actually a pretty good way to go. The other thing that we want to do is we want to be able to update the contents that are contained within there. We want to change that to an input field, but we want to use the value that's contained within there. So it might be bananas and it might be something else. And we know because we're building out the list and we're just building it out right now that we know the value that's contained within there. But let's say, for instance, we don't know the value and we want to be able to get the value. I'll show you how you can do that. So let's do temp val and selecting that row item. We can use the first element child and return back that property and then do the inner text of that first element child. And we'll just console log that out for now so we can see that within our console. So let's see what that looks like. So when we press edit, we get milk. And I know we could have gone and we know what is contained within the my list. And I did want to introduce the first element child and just different ways to traverse through the elements. So that's why we're going about it in a little bit longer format. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to be able to create an element on the fly. So let's use const, and this is going to be our new input. Let's just call it new input. And using the document, create element, and let's create an input area. And the value of the new input, we're going to set it as temp value. So it's going to contain that same value that's within the temp value. And we're also going to focus on that new input. So we're going to apply focus to that new input. And we also want to add that into append it to our parent as well. So I'm going to update this and I'm going to change that to temp element. And I'm going to take the inner text and I'm going to move it over to temp value. So still selecting that same element, but now I can grab that element and I can update some of that inner text of that element. So if I wanted to append a child to there, and we can append that new input to it. So I'll show what that looks like. And don't forget to update this one as well to temp element so that we don't have any lingering elements. So now whenever we click it, we get this, and this one needs to be updated as well. That's why we're throwing that error. So whenever we click it, we get that input area. And we also need to also remove out that existing content that's contained within there. So we can take our temp element and do inner HTML and just set that to blank. So that will get rid of the existing milk. So we're turning it into an input field. And this gives us the ability, obviously, to update it and change it, change the functionality. So we're going to add another event listener on this input field that we're just created. So taking our new input, so this one is just blur, it's not on blur, and we can launch a function whenever that event listener gets triggered. So what we want to do is whenever we're updating this, we want to select that temp element and update the inner HTML with the value of the new input. So let's try that out, see where we are right now. So now if I update it, we can click off of it and we can see that we're actually updating that inner HTML with that new value. So we click edit again with apples and we click off of it. There we go. We've got our edited value and we can remove some content if we want. And as soon as we click off of it, as soon as we do the on blur, then that means that whenever the blur goes off, that means that we've finished editing it. So it's removing it from the visual area. And just as we've seen before, that because this element isn't appearing anymore on the page, that doesn't mean that it's disappeared. So we still have that value lingering in the background of JavaScript, and that's where we're able to still apply it, even though we're removing it out of the inner HTML. One last thing, we want to change that back to white. So let's take that color, and we're going to update it and turn it back to its original, which was white. So just as we've done before, we're going to take the my list, and we've got an index value for that, and we're going to update it to be whatever the value of the input value was. So let's try that out. So now whenever I edit, I can write a bunch of stuff, and when I press delete, it rebuilds the list, and that means that this value now is sitting within our list, and you can see that there when we're outputting all of the list values. So we're able to successfully edit it, and when we click off of it, then the editing completes. So go ahead and add in all of this functionality, and coming up next, we'll do a final code review as well as a few tweaks and adjustments to the code. Welcome back. So how's your list coming along? So what we wanted to do in this lesson is do some final tweaks and adjustments to the code. We have a default list that we start with. We're able to delete items. We're able to edit items as well into the list. And you see that it kind of goes back and forth. So we've got some styling updates that we should make. So let's go into our editor and select our TD. And let's select the first child element. So that's going to be that main one where we've got the content, setting up a width for that. Let's do a really wide width and overflow. We can do an overflow hidden so that we don't have anything hovering over that particular element. So now it works a lot neater whenever we do the edit. So we're not doing that moving of those buttons, and we can delete it. We can add items to the list. And also I want to move the add items underneath our list, so which is relatively easy to do with our JavaScript. So now we can add items here right at the bottom within the list. Another thing that I wanted to do whenever we're adding the items, I'm going to rebuild this, restructure it a little bit. Whenever we're adding items, I want to clear out that value that's contained within new item. So take our new item, and we're just going to set the value to be blank so that we can't constantly do test, add, add, add. So if we don't have anything in there, you see it doesn't add it into the list. So again, edit them all on the fly whenever we want to make those edits and updates. And this is all being tracked. So this is all actually in sync. It's all actually in sync with what the contents of the my list are behind the scenes, as well as what we've got in the foreground. So what we've got in the visible area. We can also remove out some of these console messages because we don't need them anymore, as we've got all of the functionality that we set out to include in our application. So simply removing those out just cleans up the code a bit, and especially if we don't need them, there's no point for them outputting into our console. So now that we've gone through and your application should be working the same way as this one is, also make any adjustments and tweaks as needed to make sure that you've got the same functionality. And you can also introduce other functionality, and whenever you make any updates to the list, don't forget to make sure that you output that build. So coming up next, we'll do a final code review of our list making application. So it's coming up next. Welcome back. We're going to do a quick code review, and there's one minor adjustment that I wanted to make. So I used window on load launching the function of build. So there's a few different ways to do this. There's also document, and you can add event listener. And since I've been doing the add event listener functionality, let's keep this consistent, and that's what I'm going to do, this quick update, and this is going to work the same way. So we're listening for DOM content loaded, and if you're familiar with jQuery, this is the same thing as when we do document ready. So we're adding an event listener. Whenever the DOM content is loaded, that's when we're going to launch the build function. And when we refresh it, we don't see anything different. So this was just to add in for consistency. So I'm using event listeners on all of the event listeners that I've got within this project. So now let's go through and we're going to list through all of the source code and everything that we've worked on and do a quick overview of it. We set up a little bit of styling so our list looks fairly neat and nice and neat. And of course, you can update the styling as needed. We want to focus the core focus of this course on JavaScript, of course. So keeping the styling to minimal as well as the HTML to a minimal was one of the objectives of this course. Next, we came into our JavaScript. So we set up a default list that we're starting with. We selected the elements that we want to make use of within our project from our document object. And then we added in some event listeners. One of the event listeners that we added in, we wanted the ability to add items to our list. And we have a list, a global object called myList running in the background. Whenever we've got a new item, we've got an input field here where we can select the value. And whenever this button gets clicked, that means that the user wants to add a new item to the list. So what we do is we push it into the array. So it's just a JavaScript array function, and where we state the string that we want to add into our array, and then we rebuild our list. So really the core functionality is all contained within that function build. We also reset our input field of the new item. So this is new item, the query selector, add item. So updating this input field value to be blank so that we can't just keep pressing add item and have the same item adding in over and over again. So again, the core functionality is contained within build, and this is where we're building out a table dynamically using JavaScript from an array object in JavaScript. So we start by clearing out the output element. So this is that output element with a class of output that we're selecting within an object called output using query selector, selecting the element with the class of output. So what we first do is we update the inner HTML of that, send that to h2 myList, and then we go ahead and we build out our table. So with the table, we know we need to have a wrapper, and the wrapper around a table is the table element. And we know we need to add in a bunch of rows. So each one of these items needs to be listed in a row. So that's where we've got the myList loop. We're looping through all of the myList items. And as we loop through, first we create a row. So the same way as we created the table, we're creating a row element. And within that row element, we're adding the index value of the item. So in case we need to reference it, and this is a nice thing about JavaScript, within these elements, as we're creating them, they're objects, and objects we can add values into. So this is kind of a value that's sitting in the background, and you can really utilize these, especially if you've got your click events that are outside of where you're creating the element, then you can really make use of these objects because they're going to be sitting in the background. So as long as you're selecting the table row, then you can also get its index value at any time. It's a lot easier than trying to select out the name and then searching this name within the array, which is another option, but it's a little bit more complex. So it's always nice to have, and that's why that's included. And within our code, it's not really doing a whole lot, to tell you the truth. So we've got our cell. So we needed to have a couple table cells or TDs. So we created our first one, and within this one, this is where we just simply output the list contents into our inner HTML. This could also be inner text as well because we're not actually doing any HTML. So simplify it, keep it as inner text, and then we're appending it to the row. So it takes care of the first cell, which is way easier than the second cell, which is a little bit more complex, where we've got some advanced functionality. So the second cell, we create it the same way as we created the first one. So this is a container, the TD container called cell2 object. First, we create a span, and within the span, this is our ability to delete the items from the list. So we give it some inner text for the user to see that this is delete, and then we add an event listener to that element. So to that span, we've added an event listener, and then whatever we want to do within that event. So we've got an anonymous function. We could also have a name function and separate out that function from our build function. So that's another option. But because this was very simple and straightforward, and as well, we're making use of the value of I. So we've got an index value that we've got as we're iterating through. So it's really easy to splice it out of the array, and we only want to select one item. So that's why we've got index and how many items we want to splice out. And what that does is that returns the item into item out variable, which we're not using, but it's always nice to have, and it's there if we do need it. And then we're building out this visual table once again, the new myList values. And then next, we've got another span, and this is the edit span. So this one's a little bit more complex. So it starts out the same way, where we're adding in ability to click. And in this one, we're actually highlighting that entire row. Because we do have it within a row object, we can apply styles. So this is just a quick way to kind of highlight it and let the user know that we're doing something, that that one is active right now. And then going into our first child there, so we can also press edit, 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 click on it, and as soon as we click off of it, you see that it goes back to its normal form. So we've got our input that we're creating, same way as we created the other elements. So we're creating an input, and we're updating the value of the input to match the contents of our text area, our inner text. We're setting the focus on that input, so whenever we click edit, automatically the focus is going there. We're appending. Actually, this one, let's move that below the element. And the difference here is that once we've appended it to our HTML, we saw that the focus went there because we didn't have anywhere to focus because it wasn't within the visible area of our HTML. So that was a minor adjustment, and it's always good to kind of go through your code and make sure that everything is functioning as needed. So now we've got our focus being set to that active object. And you see that now once I click off of them, I can't click all of them open anymore because the blur is going off and we're resetting it. So we have that one option to update it, and when we click off of it, the updating is done. So that works a little bit better, of course. So we're updating the inner HTML of the temporary element. We're clearing out the text that's already in there, and we're adding in, and then next we add in the input that we created, and then we add the focus on that input. And we've got an event listener that we've got on that input element, which is blur. So by default, we're focusing on that element. And then basically once the blur goes off of that element, then we're doing the update. So we're updating the value of that temp area with the new input value. And then we're also adding that to the list, and we're updating the background color back to white so that we're taking the highlight off of it. And then lastly, we're appending all of these elements. So first we're appending it to our cell 2, then we're appending it to the row, and we're appending it to the table, and then lastly we're appending the whole table to the out. So quite a bit of creation of elements, and by the end of this section, I'm sure you're going to be really familiar with creating elements on the fly with JavaScript. So thanks again for taking this section, and don't forget source code is included so you can try it out for yourself. Get familiar with the functionality of JavaScript interacting with the document object model, creating elements on the fly, updating, manipulating styles, and adding in event listeners to the elements that you're creating. Take the code, try it out for yourself, and have some fun with it. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome. In this lesson, we're going to be setting up our basic application structure. So in the upcoming lessons, we're going to be creating an image generator using an image from placeholder.com. And what placeholder.com is, because it provides you placeholder images and it gives you the ability to set the dimensions of the image, also allows you to add text to the image and set up adding different colors, sizes, as well as specifying image formats. So there's quite a bit of stuff you can do, and going over to the website, you have to really customize this. So I want to make this easier, and the way that we're going to do this is using our JavaScript generator, where we're going to generate these image paths using our application in order to output that image and output the image that we want. So over here, we've got an example of background, as well as we can set the text background. So there's quite a lot of options and quite a lot of things that we can do. So let's open up our editor, and we're going to start building this application. So there's a few things that we need, and we do need quite a bit of options within a form format. So let's set those up. We're going to have a drop down, and within the drop down, we'll have different size dimensions. And you can also customize this one step further to have the ability to select the different sizes, so the width and the height as well. But for now, we're going to try to keep this as simple as possible, where we've got an option for a small image. We have an option for a medium image. And then we're going to also have an option for a large image. So let's make these a little bit bigger. So this will be 350 by 150. And this can be 650 by 350. So this should be large. And then using JavaScript, we're going to listen for changes with any one of these elements on the page. So we're going to listen for a change on the select option, as well as changes with the input area. So this is going to be a regular input type, text, allowing the user to add some text to their image. And I'll also label these as well, and then do the line breaks, text on image. And we'll refresh, see what that looks like. So we've got image size, text on image. Another one that we wanted to do is have color. So we know that we've got two options for color. We've got a background and a foreground color. So let's set those up, and we'll have two different options for that. And there are some rules here that the colors must follow the dimensions, and they're hex values as well, without the hash. The color of background, and setting it up as an HTML5 background color and color of text. And I'm going to give these ones IDs so that we can easily identify them. Let's try that one more time and do a quick refresh. So the objective now is to set up our JavaScript, and we're going to update our image output. And also one last thing, let's add in an image, and we're going to have a source for this image. And we'll leave it blank for now. This was our only image, so it's easy to select from our JavaScript. So refresh, and we're ready to move on to the next step. So go ahead and set up these basic inputs so that we can have something to work with in the upcoming lesson as we set up Java. So that's coming up next. And we're going to add event listeners as well as select these elements within our JavaScript code. And one last thing before we conclude, let's set up some default values for our colors. So we can set the background color or the color of the text to red, and then also set the background color, and we'll set it to a gray kind of color. So we've got some default background colors that are their starting colors that we can use as we build out our basic image from placeholder. So now we're ready to move on to the next step. We're bringing in the JavaScript. Now that we've got HTML set up, we're ready to bring the JavaScript in. We need to create some interaction within our form elements. So we've got a number of different form elements. We've got a select as well as inputs that we want to make interactive. Starting out with selecting the element for select so that whenever one of these options is changed, let's first set that up within an object. And I'll just call that cell, and then using a document, and we can use query selector. And we only got the one, so we can use query selector for this one. And selecting the element that has the tag of select. We can refresh and then make sure that we do have the right object. We can ready to add in an event listener for that. And then we've got a series of inputs. So let's set up an object for that as well, where we can use JavaScript to get all of the input. We can call it input all, and we're going to use document query selector and query selector all so that we're selecting all of the element inputs. And then as they get clicked, then we can distinguish between them. Next, adding in the event listener. So we've got our cell object that we see over here, doing add event listener. And the event listener that we're listening for is change. And whenever it changes, then we're going to invoke a function. And we can call that function build. So we'll run that function build. And next, we also want to add event listener. We need to create that function, of course. So let me create that. Creating a blank placeholder for that right now, and we'll pass in the event object. It actually won't matter which element triggers the build event, because we are going to be looking through all of these inputs in order to create our string. So that's why we can set them all to be invoking the same function. And we see that here we've got a node list, so we can loop through the node list. And with ES6, we can use for each. And if you're using earlier versions, if you want compatibility, you can use just a regular for loop. But in this case, let's do this within this type of format where we're going to use for each. And this will loop through each one of the items. So using a function, and then we've got the item that we can list out. And I'll show what that looks like before we add the event listener. And as we refresh, we see we've got all of the inputs get listed in our console. So that's actually exactly what we want. We want all of these inputs listed in the console so that we can attach event listeners to them. So next, we've got item. And because this is now in an object format, we can add the event listener change to that item. So refresh one more time. And now whenever I make any of these changes, you're going to see that this gets invoked. So if I type something in here, if I update the color, if I update this color, you're seeing that we're always invoking this function build, and we're adding something within the console message. So coming up next, our objective is to take the values that we've got within these input fields and then simply add them into our string. So that's still to come in the upcoming lesson, where we're going to build out our placeholder image path. So set up your event listeners to your inputs and test them out. Make sure that they're working using the console log. Welcome back. Are you ready to build the image path using our JavaScript form? So now that we've got all of the inputs set up, we've got the event listeners added in, we can remove out the console messages. And going down to build, the next objective is to get the values that are contained within these inputs and apply them into our image path. And we're going to grab them separately. So setting up a variable for that. We can also have an object for that if we wanted to. So we can create an object, call it I, and then have I size. And size would be equal to selecting that image size. And we've already got the select object and taking the value that's contained within that select object. And I'll console log out whatever the value of I is, that object I. So whenever we have any changes, and we do need to refresh that. And we see that we've got the size there. I'm also going to get rid of this console message because we don't need that anymore. Just adding more into our console there. So we've got a size of 350 by 150. We also need to select all of the values here contained within the images. And we've got all of these as a node list. And I'll show you what that looks like. So if we want to get the first one, and we know that the first input is going to be our text on the image. So if we do this and we refresh and then we do something here, we can see that we are getting that right input field. So we can easily grab the value just as we did with the select object. So that gives us the ability to get the value that's contained within there, and there we've got our value showing up. So next thing that we can do is we can write text, and this is going to be equivalent to this. And we can also get the colors the same way as we've got our background color and our foreground color. So those are the two colors that we can utilize. So we can have one, so we've got our background color, and again the same idea where we're selecting that input all. So we've already got those inputs within that node list, so we can really easily select them and utilize them. And we've got our text color. So let's see what this looks like now. So whenever we select and make any kind of selection here, we've got all of the criteria that we need and that we want to use in order to build out our placeholder image string. So we're ready to create that path. So setting that up, and we'll hard code the path for placeholder images. So if you want to set up a placeholder images, the path is always the same, where we're setting up placeholder.com and then /. So the first parameter that we need is the size. So we can add in I size into it. And the next parameter that we have is the colors. So setting up those two colors. And don't forget to break out of your quotes and break in and break out of the quotes. So the background color. And just going back to the placeholder.com just to make sure that we're getting the colors right. So it is / separated. So just making sure that the path is correct. And then I and text color. And then lastly, we're outputting some text. And you see that the format is with the question mark and then the text. So we can add the question mark and say text and then equal that. And then this will be equal to whatever the output of I text is. So anytime we make any type of update there, we see we're generating a new path for the image. And now next, all we need to do, we actually need to do one other thing, and that's removing out the hashes out of there. So we can create a function that will clean it up. As we see within placeholder.com, there's no hashes within the hex of the colors. And let's call this clean. And we can pass in a string. And within this clean string, what we want to do is we want to return back the cleaned version. So we're taking the string that's being passed in using replacing the hash with just a blank. So we can take that clean function wrap it around our values so that we can have that all within one statement. And now let's see what gets produced. So that's now the colors without the background, without the hash. Next, let's select our image object. And we have a choice here where we can do our image. So we can do my image and then using document, query selector, and selecting out the element with the tag of image. And of course, if you have more images, you've got to be a little bit more specific when you're making your selector. If you use query selector and if you've got more than one image, you're only going to get the first one being returned back within the query selection. So we've got our image, we've got the image. For images, there's an attribute, a source attribute, and then updating that to be equal to iPath. So now whenever we set up and we make some changes, you can see that we're automatically generating that new image, and it's showing up as we're generating it and as we're making the updates to it. So any of the content that we change within our form generates a new image and a new image path. So lastly, what we want to do is output this to the user, so it's really easy to select that. So after they've created the image that they want to use, the placeholder image that they want to use, then they can select that image and get the path to that image really quickly. What's coming up next? So go ahead and add this functionality into your application so that you do have the option to select the content from your input fields and add it in and make use of it within a JavaScript object that you can generate a path. So coming up next, we're going to complete this application by adding in an option for the user to be able to select the path. Welcome back. How's your generator looking? In this lesson, we're going to do some tweaks and updates to make the application even better. So I was looking at how the text is generated out. So we've got visit plus blogging.com. So instead of spaces, and if we do add in a space, it turns out and it looks okay, but the format is not exactly the same as we've got within placeholder.com. So usually, even though it works, it's a good idea to add in the spaces as plus signs. And with JavaScript, that's really easy to do. So setting up another function that we're going to use, and we're going to call this spacers, passing in a string value. And the same as what we did with where we're returning back the hash, where we're cleaning out the hash. We're going to return back a value. And this one's going to be a little bit different because we're going to take our string and we're going to split by space. And then we're going to join it back together. And we saw earlier that what split does is it turns it into an array. So it turns the string into an array. So what will happen here is when we've got test, or we could have test1, test2, it'll split it by the space. So it'll create an array with two items in it. So the first one and the second one, splitting it by the space. And then we want to join that back together using the join method, which brings an array into a string and joining it back together using the plus. So effectively, what will happen here when we pass in a value into spacers is it will be returned back with the plus. So let's wrap that input value with the function spacers and see what happens. Refresh, and we've got test1, test2, test3. And as soon as we click off of it, you see that now we're generating that path, and it looks a lot more proper. It looks a lot more like what is on placeholder.com. We also needed to add in a way to be able to select that value. So we can use an input for this one, or we can use a text area to be different. And this text area is where we can set adding in some rows to that, adding in columns to that, and we'll leave it blank for now. And the idea is that once we create our path, I want the user to be able to select this text area and place it into their clipboard, selecting another object that we're going to use in order to hold the text area. And since there's only one of them, we can use query selector and select it by the tag. So taking our tag of text area, so now we've got it within the text area object. And we can use that, and also we're setting our image path source, and we're also updating the value to be equal to the I path. So now try that out, and if we have any changes, and you can see that now we're outputting it here. And what I also want to be able to do is select that area. So let's select that area, using the select option, select method. We can also add focus to that area, so putting the focus on that as well. So try that out. So now whenever we make any updates, we've got focus on there, we've got it selected, and we can also copy it to the clipboard as well. So using the document exec command, and that command is copy, we're going to copy that selected item. So one more time, we'll try that. And now we've got that copied. So if I take that and if I paste it, you can see that I've already copied that in and I can paste it anywhere I want. So if I wanted to paste it within a URL, I could paste that and we can see that that image is now popping up. So this is the same one that we've generated. So it's nice, neat usability for the user in order to be able to simply generate that, and it already gets copied into their clipboard. So as soon as they click off of that, it generates it and it's already copied into the clipboard, ready to go and ready for them to use and paste into any project that they want. And as you can see, once again, once we've made the changes, if I paste it, this is that new one that we've just created. And that was just a simple demonstration that we can paste it in, and we've already got it in our clipboard. So that's the application, and coming up next, we'll do a quick run through and a code review of all of the functionality that we've built in the earlier lessons. So go ahead and add this new option into your project. So this is the ability to output that as a text area, as a selectable area that the user can select, as well as copy it automatically into their clipboard. Your image generator coming along. So I hope you've had the opportunity to try out and build out your own version of this application. And I also do encourage you to extend on this. There's quite a few improvements that you can make, and you can make generating images really easy, as well as practicing working with JavaScript. So there's a number of other options that you can still add in, where you can add in the different formats. So we've got PNGs, GIFs, JPEGs. So if you want to have a specific format within the image, you can add that into the string, as well as add it into the generator within a drop-down list, and so on. So really challenge yourself, have some fun with it, building out an image generator. So now we're going to do a quick overview of the code. And first, we started out by selecting and creating our inputs that we needed in order to generate the path. So we identified that we needed some dimensions. So we set these as defaults. And this is another one that you can break apart and have separate different input fields for these values in order to have even more customization for those placeholder images that are being generated. Then there's the text on image, background colors, and also we just identified that you can also add in the different types of images. So that was another option that's available there. And we didn't go into that in the project, but it's just as easy as adding in even more input fields. And I do encourage you to try that out and to add those in so that you can get really familiar with how you can generate and create these types of applications. Lastly, we had a text area. This is where our output gets added for the user to be able to see visibly, as well as select and copy, and then they can copy it into their own projects. Next, we use JavaScript in order to connect to our objects contained within the document, added in event listeners to those. And the event listeners are all going over to the same function because the functionality is the same. All we're doing is listening for the changes within the inputs. And as long as there's been a change within the input, then we know that we need to rebuild our visuals. So rebuild the image that's being output, as well as, of course, rebuild the path that the user is trying to generate. We select all of the element values added into an object called I. And then within that object I, this is where all the details are sitting. We can add and update the size, the background color, the text color, and the text output. We needed to also add in a few functions to clean up the code, where we needed to remove out the hashes from the colors, as well as when we've got multiple words within the text string, we want to join them with a plus sign. So created a couple helper functions in order to accomplish that, wrapped the values with those helper functions in order to clean those up and format them as needed. Then we added in the image into the visible area, into our default image area that we've got on our page, as well as we updated the value of text area with the new path that's just been generated. We selected that area using JavaScript. We set the focus on that text area using JavaScript. And then lastly, we executed the copy command to copy that content into the user's browser so they can use that within their clipboard and paste the path as needed. Thanks again for taking this section, and I hope you've enjoyed it, as well as if you need any clarification or have any questions in regards to the content, I'm always happy to help answer and address those. And I hope to see you again in the next one.